Alright, so I had tried to research the history of the man that they call Dracula, whose name was Vlad Tepes. And he's the character that all the modern Dracula legend is based off of, even though a lot of it is untrue. And when I found out a while ago, when I downloaded the audiobook of Bram Stoker's Dracula in order to read it, when I found out that they had taken a real character, a real guy that had a life, and instead of doing a thorough biography on him, embellished the story with all sorts of falsehoods and basically made it into a horror novel. That put up a red flag for me. To me, it would seem like the character assassinated him long after the time of his death. And then when I went to look around and find some information about old Vlad there, it's very rare. It's hard to find information about him. You can buy people's books at your own risk, and you don't know what kind of background you're actually getting from those books. But in terms of what information is available to the public, it's alarmingly rare. I did find an essay by a guy named Ray Porter from 1992. And this looks to be alright. So I'm going to go ahead and read this essay off, as I typically do with books, to turn them into audiobooks. Because like I said, when I looked around the internet, including YouTube and other video sites, to see if anybody had done any research on this Vlad guy, I didn't find anything. And that's alarming, given that he's pretty famous. As a fictional character, of course, not as the guy he was. They went ahead and they made him famous, really famous, but they won't tell you the real story about him. So, anyway, here we go. The Historical Dracula by Ray Porter, 1992. Part 1, Historical Background. Most of you, the members of this list, are probably aware of the fact that when Bram Stoker penned his immortal classic, Dracula, he based his vampire villain on an actual historical figure. Stoker's model was Vlad III Dracula, called Tepes, a 15th century voivode, or prince, of Wallachia, of the princely house of Basarab. Wallachia is a province of Romania, bordered to the north by Transylvania and Moldavia, to the east by the Black Sea, and to the south by Bulgaria. Wallachia first emerged as a political entity during the late 13th century from the weltering confusion left behind in the Balkans as the Eastern Roman Empire slowly crumbled. The first prince of Wallachia was Basarab the Great, 1310 to 1352. An ancestor of Dracula. Despite the splintering of the family into two royal clans, some members of the House of Basarab continued to govern Wallachia from that time until well after the Ottomans reduced the principality to the status of a client state. Dracula was the last prince of Wallachia to retain any real measure of independence. In order to understand the life of Vlad Dracula, it is first necessary to understand something about the nature of Wallachian society and politics. The throne of Wallachia was hereditary, but not by the law of primogeniture? Primogeniture? That's a new one for me. The boyars, or great nobles, had the right to elect the voivode from among the various eligible members of the royal family. As with most elective monarchies during the Middle Ages, the power of the central government tended to be dissipated among the nobility as various members of the ruling family vied for the throne. Wallachian politics also tended to be very bloody. Assassination was a common means of eliminating rivals, and many of the voivodes, I don't know what this word is or how to pronounce it, Voivodes, ended their lives violently and prematurely. By the late 15th century, the House of Basarab had split into two rival clans, the descendants of Prince Dan and those of Prince Mircea the Old, which is Dracula's grandfather. These two branches of the royal house were bitter rivals. Both Dracula and his father, Vlad II Dracul, murdered rivals from the dynasty upon reaching the throne. The second ascendant fact of the 15th century Wallachian political life was the influence of powerful neighbors. In 1453, Constantinople had, and the last vestiges of the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, which had blocked the Islam's access to Europe for nearly 1,000 years, succumbed to the armed might of the Ottoman Turks under Sultan Muhammad the Conqueror. Long before the fall of the imperial city, the Ottomans had penetrated deep into the Balkans. Dracula's grandfather, Mircea the Old, was forced to pay tribute to the Sultan early in the 15th century. The Hungarian kingdom to the north and west of Wallachia reached the zenith of its power during the 15th century and assumed Constantinople's ancient mantle as defender of Christendom. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, the princes of Wallachia attempted to maintain a precarious independence by constantly shifting allegiances between these powerful neighbors. Dracula ruled as Prince of Wallachia on 3 separate occasions. He first claimed the throne with Turkish support in 1448. On this occasion he ruled only for 2 months, October to November, before being driven out by a dynasty claimant supported by Hungary. Dracula dwelt in exile for several years before returning to Wallachia to kill the dynasty prince, Vladislav II, and reclaim the Wallachian throne with Hungarian support. Dracula's second regnal period, regnal, stretched from 1456 to 1462. It was during this time that Dracula carried out his most famous military exploits against the Turks and also committed his most gruesome atrocities. What do you mean, atrocities? You mean impaling Muslims on stakes? Impaling Muslim invaders on stakes? Well, that's not an atrocity. That's what you should do. Anyway, continuing on. In 1462, Dracula fled to Transylvania to seek the aid of the King of Hungary when a Turkish army overwhelmed Wallachia. Instead of receiving the assistance he expected, Dracula was imprisoned by the Hungarian king. He remained a prisoner of Matthias Corvinus of Hungary for several years. For most of the period of Dracula's incarceration, his brother, Radu the Handsome, ruled Wallachia as a puppet of the Ottoman Sultan. When Radu died, circa 1474 to 1475, the Sultan appointed Basarab the Old, a member of the dynasty clan, as prince. Eventually, Dracula regained the favor and support of the Hungarian king. In 1476, he once again invaded Wallachia. His small force consisted of a few loyal Wallachians, a contingent of Moldavians, sent by his cousin Prince Stefan the Great of Moldavia, and a contingent of Transylvanians under their prince, Stephen Bathory. Oh, that's interesting. The surname Bathory has just made its entrance to the story. Erzsébet Bathory is someone I've also had a lot of difficulty finding good historic information on. The Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who was reputed to have bathed in the blood of virgins. Well, her surname just made it into this story, and like I said, it's really hard to find information on her too, actually historically credible information. Anyway, continuing on. The Allies succeeded in driving Basarab out of the country and placing Dracula on the throne. However, after Dracula was once again in control, Stephen Bathory returned to Transylvania, taking most of Dracula's army with him. The Turks soon counterattacked with overwhelming force. Dracula was killed fighting the Turks near Bucharest in December of 1476. His head was sent to Constantinople, where the Sultan had it displayed on a stake to prove that the terrible impaler was really dead. But that's not an atrocity, is it? The author didn't call that an atrocity. He didn't cast that act in a damning light like he did Vlad impaling Muslims on stakes. He just states it matter-of-factly that the head was sent to Constantinople, where the Sultan had it displayed on a stake to prove that the terrible impaler was really dead. I'm going to, if I was a betting man, I would put my money on this author being a Judeo-Christian. And here's the thing about Judeo-Christians. Whether or not you hear them spouting rhetoric against Islam, those are three Abrahamic brothers in the same bathtub. You get what I'm saying? You can't separate Christianity from Islam. They've been pretty much tied at the hip, whether or not they war against each other since Islam's inception in the 7th century AD, I believe. And so here you see it's almost like a subconscious emergence of the author. Just 2 paragraphs ago, he calls Vlad's act of impaling Muslims on stakes an atrocity. And here he has failed to cast that in a highly negative context when he says that the Sultan of Constantinople put Vlad's head on a stake for everybody to see. Anyway, continuing on. Part 2. What's in a name? There has been considerable debate among scholars concerning the meaning of the name Dracula. The name is clearly related to Dracula's father, Sobriquet. Dracul. Drac in Romanian means devil, and ul is the definitive article. Therefore, Dracul literally means the devil. The ulia ending in Romanian indicates the son of. Under this interpretation, Dracula becomes Vlad III, son of the devil. See, this is what I mean here. Pretty much half of this story is going to be tainted with Judeo-Christian nonsense. When they take his real name and they turn it into Vlad Dracula, they're doing the whole, the devil! The devil! You know, they always do that. When you hear them going on about the devil, or you hear someone saying the devil, that's straight out of Christianity. You really can't separate it. Calling things the devil is a Christian thing to do. Anyway, continuing on. The experts who support this interpretation usually claim that Vlad II earned his devilish nickname by his clever and wily political maneuvering. Oh yeah, I'm sure that's how he named it. Could he have been a pagan? Was he like a high pagan figure or something? Is that the real truth here? The second interpretation of the name is more widely accepted. In 1431, Vlad II was invested with the Order of the Dragon by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg. The Order of the Dragon was a knightly order dedicated to fighting the Turk. Interesting. Its emblem was a dragon, wings extended, hanging on a cross. From 1431 onward, Vlad II wore the emblem of the order. His coinage bore the dragon symbol. The dragon was the symbol of the devil. Oh, there we go. There's the devil again, and consequently, the alternate meaning of Drac was dragon. Under this interpretation, Vlad II Dracula becomes Vlad II the Dragon, and his son, Vlad III Dracula, and becomes Vlad... Alright, sorry that stopped making sense for a second. Becomes Vlad III, the son of the dragon. There is some confusion in the secondary sources concerning Dracula's exact title. In most of the sources, he is referred to as Vlad III. However, many sources refer to him as Vlad IV or Vlad V. I am somewhat at a loss to explain this confusion. I bet you are. I'll tell you what, when you got when you've got the sons of Abraham, when you've got the Abrahamics in charge of handing your history down to you, you can bet there's going to be some confusion in that history. Continuing on, the list of Wallachian princes that I have seen would seem to make the correct title Vlad III. The only conclusion I have been able to reach is that there is some confusion in the sources between the various voivods named Vlad and Vladislav. This argument gains credence when one realizes that Dracula occasionally signed his name Vladislaus. I would welcome an explanation from anyone capable of resolving this problem. Yeah, I might want to hit this guy up if he's still alive. Part 3. The Life of Vlad III Dracula, called the Impaler, 1431 to 1476. Dracula was born in 1431 in the Transylvanian city of Sighiswara. At that time, Dracula's father, Vlad II Dracula, was living in exile in Transylvania. Vlad Dracula was in Transylvania attempting to gather support for his planned effort to seize the Wallachian throne from the dynasty prince, Alexandru I. The house where Dracula was born is still standing. In 1431, it was located in a prosperous neighborhood surrounded by the homes of Saxon and Magyar merchants and the townhouses of the nobility. Little is known about the early years of Dracula's life. It is known he had an elder brother, Mircea, and a younger brother named Radu. His early education was left in the hands of his mother, a Transylvanian noblewoman, and her family. His real education began in 1436 after his father succeeded in claiming the Wallachian throne and killing his dynasty rival. His training was typical to that common to the sons of nobility throughout Europe. His first tutor in his apprenticeship to knighthood was an elderly boyar whom had fought under the banner of Anguirand de Corsi at the Battle of Nicopolis against the Turks. Dracula learned all the skills of war and peace that were deemed necessary for a Christian knight. The political situation in Wallachia remained unstable after Vlad Dracula seized the throne in 1436. The power of the Turks was growing rapidly as one by one the small states of the Balkans surrendered to the Ottoman onslaught. At the same time, the power of Hungary was reaching its zenith and would peak during the time of John Hunyadi, the White Knight of Hungary, and his son, King Matthias Corvinus. Any prince of Wallachia had to balance his policies precariously between these two powerful neighbors. The Prince of Wallachia was officially a vassal to the King of Hungary. In addition, Vlad Dracula was a member of the Order of the Dragon and sworn to fight the infidel. At the same time, the power of the Ottomans seemed unstoppable. Even in the time of Vlad's father, Mircea the Old, Wallachia had been forced to pay tribute to the Sultan. Vlad was forced to renew that tribute, and from 1436 to 1442 attempted to walk a middle course between his powerful neighbors. In 1442, Vlad attempted to remain neutral when the Turks invaded Transylvania. The Turks were defeated, and the vengeful Hungarians, under John Hunyadi, forced Dracula and his family to flee Wallachia. Hunyadi placed a dynasty, Basarab II, on the Wallachian throne. In 1443, Vlad II regained the Wallachian throne with Turkish support, and on the condition that he signed a new treaty with the Sultan that included not only the customary annual tribute, but the promise to yearly send contingents of Wallachian boys to join the Sultan's Janissaries. In 1444, to further assure to the Sultan of his good faith, Vlad sent his two younger sons to Adrianople as hostages. Dracula remained as a hostage in Adrianople until 1448. In 1444, the King of Hungary, Ladislaus Posthumus, that's an interesting surname, broke the peace and launched the Varna campaign under the command of John Hunyadi in an effort to drive the Turks out of Europe. Hunyadi demanded that Vlad II fulfill his oath as a member of the Order of the Dragon and a vassal of Hungary and join the crusade against the Turk. The Pope absolved Dracula of his Turkish oath, but the wily politician still attempted to steer a middle course. Rather than join the Christian forces himself, he sent his oldest son, Mircea. Perhaps he hoped that the Sultan would spare his younger sons if he himself did not join the crusade. The results of the Varna crusade are well known. The Christian army was utterly destroyed in the Battle of Varna. John Hunyadi managed to escape the battle under conditions that add little glory to the White Knight's reputation. Many, apparently including Mircea and his father, blamed Hunyadi for the debacle. From this moment forth, John Hunyadi was bitterly hostile toward Vlad Dracula and his eldest son. In 1444, Vlad Dracula was assassinated along with his son, Mircea. Mircea was apparently buried alive by the boyars and merchants of Târgoviște. Hunyadi placed his own candidate, a member of the dynasty clan, on the throne of Wallachia. On receiving the news of Vlad Dracula's death, the Turks released Dracula and supported him as their own candidate for the Wallachian throne. Huh? In 1448, Dracula managed to briefly seize the Wallachian throne with Turkish support. Within 2 months, Hunyadi forced Dracula to surrender the throne and flee to his cousin, the Prince of Moldavia, while Hunyadi once again placed Vladislav II on the Wallachian throne. Dracula remained in exile in Moldavia for 3 years until Prince Bogdan of Moldavia was assassinated in 1451. The resulting turmoil in Moldavia forced Dracula to flee to Transylvania and seek the protection of his family enemy, Hunyadi. The timing was propitious. Hunyadi's puppet on the Wallachian throne, Vladislav II, had instituted a pro-Turkish policy, and Hunyadi needed a more reliable man in Wallachia. Consequently, Hunyadi accepted the allegiance of his old enemy's son and put him forward as the Hungarian candidate for the throne of Wallachia. Dracula became Hunyadi's vassal and received his father's old Transylvanian duchies of Faragas and Almas. Dracula remained in Transylvania under Hunyadi's protection until 1456, waiting for an opportunity to retake Wallachia from his rival. In 1453, the Christian world was shocked by the final fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. The East Roman Empire, which had existed since the time of Constantine the Great, and which for 1,000 years had shielded the rest of Christendom from Islam, oh what a joke, was no more. Hunyadi immediately began planning another campaign against the Turks. In 1456, Hunyadi invaded Turkish Serbia while Dracula simultaneously invaded Wallachia. In the Battle of Belgrade, Hunyadi routed the Ottoman host of Sultan Mohammed, forcing the Turks to withdraw to Constantinople. Hunyadi planned to push the war into Turkey, but disease ravaged his forces in the weeks following the battle, claiming Hunyadi himself on August 11, 1456. Meanwhile, Dracula succeeded in killing Vladislav II and taking the Wallachian throne, but Hunyadi's death made his long-term tenure questionable. For a long time at least, Dracula was forced to attempt to placate the Turks while he solidified his own position. Dracula's main reign stretched from 1456 to 1462. His capital was the city of Trgovista, while his castle was raised some distance away in the mountains of the Argus River. Most of the atrocities associated with Dracula's name took place in these years. It was also during this time that he launched his own campaign against the Turks. His campaign was relatively successful at first. His skill as a warrior and his well-known cruelty made him a much feared enemy. However, he received little support from his titular overlord, Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, and Wallachia's resources were too limited to achieve any lasting success against the conqueror of Constantinople. The Turks finally succeeded in forcing Dracula to flee to Transylvania in 1462. Reportedly, his first wife committed suicide by leaping from the towers of Dracula's castle into the waters of the Argus River, rather than surrender to the Turks. Dracula had escaped across the mountains into Transylvania and appealed to Matthias Corvinus for aid. Instead, the king had Dracula arrested and imprisoned in a royal tower near Buda. Dracula remained a prisoner for 12 years. Apparently, his imprisonment was none too onerous. He was able to gradually win his way back into the graces of Hungary's monarch, so much that he was able to meet and marry a member of the royal family. Some of the sources claim Dracula's second wife was actually the sister of Matthias Corvinus. The openly pro-Turkish policy of Dracula's brother, Radu the Handsome, who was Prince of Wallachia during most of Dracula's captivity, probably was a factor in Dracula's rehabilitation. During his captivity, Dracula also renounced the Orthodox faith and adopted Catholicism. It is interesting to note that the Russian narrative, normally very favorable to Dracula, indicates that even in captivity he could not give up his favorite pastime. He often captured birds and mice, which he proceeded to torture and mutilate. Some were beheaded or tarred and feathered and released. Most were impaled on tiny spears. Okay. The exact length of Dracula's period of captivity is open to some debate. The Russian pamphlets indicate that he was a prisoner from 1462 until 1474. However, during that period, Dracula managed to marry a member of the Hungarian royal family and have two sons who were about 10 years old when he reconquered Wallachia in 1476. McNally and Florescu placed Dracula's actual period of confinement at about 4 years from 1462 to 1466. It is unlikely that a prisoner would be allowed to marry into the royal family. Diplomatic correspondence from Buda during the period in question also seems to support the claim that Dracula's actual period of confinement was relatively short. Apparently, in years between his release in 1474, when he began preparations for the reconquest of Wallachia, Dracula resided with his new wife in a house in the Hungarian capital. One anecdote from that period tells how a Hungarian captain followed a thief into Dracula's house. When Dracula discovered the intruders, he killed the Hungarian officer rather than the thief. When questioned about his actions by the king, Dracula answered that a gentleman does not enter the presence of a great ruler without an introduction. Had the captain followed proper protocol, he would have not incurred the wrath of the prince. In 1476, Dracula was again ready to make another bid for power. Dracula and Prince Stephen Bathory of Transylvania invaded Wallachia with a mixed force of Transylvanians, a few dissatisfied Wallachian boyars, and a contingent of Moldavians sent by Dracula's cousin, Prince Stephen the Great of Moldavia. Dracula's brother, Radu the Handsome, had died a couple of years earlier and had been replaced on the Wallachian throne by another Turkish candidate, Basarab the Old, a member of the Dynasty clan. At the approach of Dracula's army, Basarab and his cohorts fled, some to the protection of the Turks, others to the shelter of the mountains. After placing Dracula on the throne, Stephen Bathory and the bulk of Dracula's forces returned to Transylvania, leaving Dracula's tactical position very weak. Dracula had little time to gather support before a large Turkish army entered Wallachia, determined to return Basarab to the throne. Dracula's cruelties over the years had alienated the boyars who felt that they had a better chance of surviving under Prince Basarab. Apparently, even the peasants, tired of the depredations of the Impaler, abandoned him to his fate. Dracula was forced to march to meet the Turks with the small forces at his disposal, somewhat less than 4,000 men. Dracula was killed in battle against the Turks near the small town of Bucharest in December of 1476. Some reports indicated that he was assassinated by a disloyal Wallachian boyar just as he was about to sweep the Turks from the field. Other accounts have Dracula falling in defeat, surrounded by the bodies of his loyal Moldavian bodyguard. Still other reports claim that Dracula, at the moment of victory, was accidentally struck down by one of his own men. Dracula's body was decapitated by the Turks and his head sent to Constantinople, where the Sultan had it displayed on a stake as proof that the Impaler was dead. He was reportedly buried at Snagov, an island monastery located near Bucharest. And here they're restating what they already told you earlier in the essay. You know, it makes it just more suspect. Why are they restating this? Almost verbatim. And then we move on to part 4. Atrocities. Okay, this is really interesting, and pay close attention to how they word this and the detail that they go into. And tell me if you think this was written by a person who was reviewing gruesome historical facts and writing an essay, or someone who was taking great joy in writing an account of fiction, hoping to slander and smear somebody's name. More human than anything else, the historical Dracula is known for his inhuman cruelty. Impalement was Dracula's preferred method of torture and execution. Impalement was, and is, one of the most gruesome ways of dying imaginable. Dracula usually had a horse attached to each of the victim's legs, and a sharpened stake was gradually forced into the body. Now, hold on a minute. Let's stop right there and let's look at what was just said. He had horses pulling the victim down onto the stake, but the horses were doing this gradually? I'm not sure really how you would do that gradually. The end of the stake was usually oiled, and care was taken that the stake not be too sharp, else the victim might die too rapidly from shock. Okay, let's look at that there. And we're going sentence by sentence here. The stake shouldn't be too sharp or the victim might die rapidly from shock. Alright, if you have a stake that's dull, it's harder to force through the body and it's going to be more painful. Okay, the more tissue trauma you do going through the body, the more painful it's going to be. So, that statement right there, we know is bullshit. And, listen to the pornographic way that they describe this process. Like, they're taking delight in describing this in detail. The end of the stake was usually oiled, and care was taken, blah, 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 blah. Who survived to tell this story? That's what I want to know. Who survived that was there to be doing these things and got out of that place and was able to tell you that this was how it was done? Or, I mean, did you walk up to the stake and surmise that it was oiled at the top? So, okay, whatever. Doesn't make any sense, sorry. Normally the stake was inserted into the body through the buttocks and was often forced through the body until it emerged from the mouth. However, there were many instances where victims were impaled through other bodily orifices or through the abdomen or chest. Infants were sometimes impaled on the stake, forced through their mother's chests. Wait. So you've got Turks invading through the mountains, and they have infants and mothers with them? I'm not understanding it. Where's he getting the infants and mothers from? How is he getting a hold of these? Are these his own people? Is that what they're trying to say? Because they're not being very clear if it is. The records indicate that victims were sometimes impaled so that they hung upside down on the stake. Death by impalement was slow and painful. Yeah, you already said that. Victims sometimes endured for hours or days. Dracula often had the stakes arranged in various geometric patterns. Ooh, Satan. The most common pattern was a ring of concentric circles in the outskirts of a city that was his target. Alright. I thought he was dealing with invaders here. Apparently he's targeting cities. I missed something here. The height of the spear indicated the rank of the victim. The decaying corpses were often left up for months. It was once reported that an invading Turkish army turned back in fright when it encountered thousands of rotting corpses impaled on the banks of the Danube. In 1461, Muhammad II, the conqueror of Constantinople, a man not noted for his squeamishness, I bet if you're a child fucker you're not squeamish, returned to Constantinople after being sickened by the sight of 20,000 impaled corpses outside of Dracula's capital of Turgovista. The warrior sultan turned command of the campaign against Dracula over to the subordinates and returned to Constantinople. What? Yeah, that doesn't make any sense either. He's the highest leader among them, and he can't tolerate gore? That just doesn't seem how Muslims work. Usually the most depraved among the Muslims works his way up to become a leader. Thousands were often impaled at a single time. 10,000 were impaled in the Transylvanian city of Sibiu, where Dracula had once lived, in 1460. In 1459, on St. Bartholomew's Day, Dracula had 30,000 of the merchants and boyars of the Transylvanian city of Brasov impaled. Yeah, that sounds believable to me. On St. Bartholomew's Day, it means in the course of one day, Dracula and his army managed to impale 30,000 people. He captured and he impaled 30,000 people in one day. How many horses did that take? One of the most famous woodcuts of the period shows Dracula feasting amongst a forest of stakes and their grisly burdens outside Brasov, while a nearby executioner cuts apart other victims. What? So now the executioner's cutting people apart? Why isn't he executing people? I mean, he sounds like you keep him real busy. How's he have time to stop and cut people apart, too? Okay, sure. Yeah, you know what? It just sounds like something that's thrown in there to intensify the story. And I'm not claiming that the 1992 author of this essay threw it in there. I don't know where this detail originated from, but, shit like this is just not believable to me. It sounds like a badly written horror movie. Impalement was Dracula's favorite, but by no means his only method of torture. The list of tortures employed by this cruel prince reads like an inventory of hell's tools. Oh, give me a fucking break. Nails in heads, cutting off of limbs, blinding, strangulation, burning, cutting off of noses and ears, mutilation of sexual organs, especially in the case of women, scalping, skinning, exposure to the elements or to wild animals, and boiling alive. Now, listeners, it's important, before I go on with this, having heard the allegations made against Dracula, who was one man and was alleged to have done all this torture in these numerous, very inventive ways, you need to keep in mind that professional torture methods were invented by the Judeo-Christians. They perfected the art of torture. I mean, they'll come right out on the History Channel and tell you that the Vatican, during the medieval times, operated huge torture chambers and invented all sorts of torture machines. But so none of this should really be shocking to any Christian or Catholic who accepts the history of what they are and accepts that without the Vatican, without the Catholic Church, they would never have Christianity right now. They wouldn't even know what it is. It would be something they study in ancient history. And especially the apologists, they admit to this stuff, and hey, it's okay, Jesus, he forgives everybody. So the fact that the people who brought us our religion did lots and lots and lots of torture, that's okay, because Jesus forgives it. Anyway, continuing on. No one was immune to Dracula's attentions. His victims included women and children, peasants and great lords, ambassadors from foreign powers, and merchants. However, the vast majority of his victims came from the merchants and boyars of Transylvania and his own Wallachia. Many have attempted to justify Dracula's actions on the basis of nascent nationalism and political necessity. Oh, okay. Alright, we're starting to get useful pieces of the puzzle thrown to us here. There's talk of nationalism and political necessity. Well, hell, why didn't you mention that before? Many of the merchants in Transylvania and Wallachia were Saxons who were seen as parasites. Parasites, huh? They weren't... Nah, I can't say it. YouTube will ban me. Did their names echo these parasites? Preying upon Romanian natives of Wallachia, while the boyars had proven their disloyalty time and time again. This just sounds like an echo of what's going on right now in our own political situation here in America and in Europe. Dracula's own father and older brother were murdered by unfaithful boyars. However, many of Dracula's victims were Wallachians, and few deny that he derived a perverted pleasure from his actions. Dracula began his reign of terror almost as soon as he came to power. His first significant act of cruelty may have been motivated by a desire of revenge, as well as a need to solidify his power. Early in his main reign, he gave a feast for his boyars and their families to celebrate Easter. Dracula was well aware that many of these same nobles were part of the conspiracy that led to his father's assassination and the burying alive of his brother Mircea. Many had also played a role in the overthrow of numerous Wallachian princes. During the feast, Dracula asked his noble guests how many princes had ruled during their lifetimes. All of the nobles present had outlived several princes. One answered that at least 30 princes had held the throne during his life. No one had seen less than 7 reigns. Dracula immediately had all the assembled nobles arrested. The older boyars and their families were impaled on the spot. The younger and healthier nobles and their families were marched north from Turgovista to the ruins of a castle in the mountains above the Argus River. Dracula was determined to rebuild this ancient fortress as his own stronghold and refuge. The enslaved boyars and their families were forced to labor for months rebuilding the old castle with materials from another nearby ruin. According to the reports, they labored until the clothes fell off their bodies and then were forced to continue working naked. Very few of the old gentry survived the ordeal of building Castle Dracula. Throughout his reign, Dracula systematically eradicated the old boyar class of Wallachia. The old boyars had repeatedly undermined the power of the prince during previous reigns and had been responsible for the violent overthrow of several princes. Apparently, Dracula was determined that his own power be on a modern and thoroughly secure footing. In the place of the executed boyars, Dracula promoted new men from among the free peasantry and middle class, men who would be loyal only to their prince. Many of Dracula's acts of cruelty can be interpreted as efforts to strengthen and modernize the central government at the expense of the feudal powers of nobility in great towns. Dracula was also constantly on guard against the adherents of the dynasty clan. Some of his raids into Transylvania may have been efforts to capture the would-be princes of the dynasty. Several members of the dynasty clan died at Dracula's hands. Vladislav II was murdered soon after Dracula came to power in 1456. Another dynasty prince was captured during one of Dracula's forays into Transylvania. Thousands of citizens of the town that had sheltered his rival were impaled by Dracula. The captured dynasty prince was forced to read his own funeral oration while kneeling before an open grave before his execution. Dracula's atrocities against the people of Wallachia were usually attempts to enforce his own moral code upon his county. He's got morals, huh? Oh, this gets interesting. He appears to have been particularly concerned with female chastity. Maidens who lost their virginity, adulterous wives, and unchaste widows were all targets of Dracula's cruelty. So, it's starting to tally up and sound like an echo of some things we've seen before, right? We're hearing about him condemning the merchant class. Now he has morals, sexual morals. And nationalism? Such women often had their sexual organs cut out or their breasts cut off. They were also often impaled through the vagina on red-hot stakes. The wood was red hot, is that what you mean? Or do you use steel stakes? Because wood doesn't get red hot. You get embers. Anyway, that were forced through the body until they emerged from the mouth. One report tells of the execution of an unfaithful wife. Dracula had the woman's breasts cut off. Then she was skinned and impaled in a square in Turgovist with her skin lying on a nearby table. And Dracula also insisted that his people be honest and hard-working. Merchants who cheated their customers were likely to find themselves mounted on a stake beside common thieves. So he wants to enforce fiduciary responsibility among the merchants, and they felt it necessary to mention that. Part 5. Anecdotal Evidence. Much of the information we have about Vlad III comes from pamphlets published in Germany and Russia after his death. German pamphlets appeared shortly after Dracula's death and, at least initially, may have been politically inspired. At that time, Matthias Corvinus of Hungary was seeking to bolster his own reputation in the Holy Roman Empire and may have intended the early pamphlets as justification of his less than vigorous support of the vassal. The pamphlets were also a form of mass entertainment in a society where the printing press was just coming into widespread use. Yeah, and it was invented in China thousands of years before that. How about that? I wonder how the printing press is not in common use already here in the 14th century Europe. Much like the subject matter of the supermarket tabloids of today, the cruel life of the Wallachian tyrant was easily sensationalized. The pamphlets were reprinted numerous times over the 30 or so years following Dracula's death, strong proof of their popularity. The German pamphlets painted Dracula as an inhuman monster who terrorized the land and butchered innocents with a sadistic glee. Hey, kind of like this so-called historical account does, huh? The Russian pamphlets took a somewhat different view. The princes of Moscow were at the time just beginning to build the basis of what would become the autocracy of the Tsars. They were also having considerable trouble with disloyal, often troublesome boyars. In Russia, Dracula was presented as a cruel but just prince. Oh, isn't that interesting? You've got a whole nation taking his side and saying that although he was cruel, he was just. Huh. Don't forget that. That's of crucial importance here. Whose actions were directed toward the greater good of his people. Despite the differences in interpretation, the pamphlets, regardless of their land of origin, agree remarkably well as to specifics. The level of agreement between the various pamphlets has led most historians to conclude that at least the broad outlines of the events covered actually occurred. Romanian verbal tradition provides another important source for the life of Vlad Dracula. Legends and tales concerning the Impaler have remained a part of folklore among the Romanian peasantry. These tales have been passed down from generation to generation for 500 years. Through constant retelling, they have become somewhat garbled and confused, and they are gradually being forgotten by the younger generations. However, they still provide valuable information about Dracula and his relationship with his people. Many of the tales contained in the pamphlets are also found in the verbal tradition, though with a somewhat different emphasis. Among the Romanian peasantry, Dracula is remembered as a just prince. Well, look at that. We've got another group of people who claim that he was a just prince. That's two now. Who defended his people from foreigners. Foreigners, you say? You wouldn't think a nationalist would want to defend his people from foreigners. That's just, nationalists don't do that. Whether those foreigners be Turkish invaders or German merchants. German merchants, huh? That's the first time in this essay that they've called the merchants German. Now, what's interesting is that we know that the Yiddish language, which is what most Jewish people use, not Hebrew. The majority of all Jews do not understand or use Hebrew. They speak Yiddish. Yiddish comes from High German. It's adapted from the High German language. Way back when. I believe around the time of, maybe within a century, plus or minus, of Vlad's escapades here. He is also remembered as somewhat of a champion of the common man against the oppression of the boyars. Dracula's fierce insistence on honesty is a central part of the verbal tradition. So, they venerate this guy in a verbal tradition that gets passed down over the generations. And they claim that Dracula had a fierce insistence on honesty. You know, so do I. So do I. In fact, I've told off family members. I've told off friends. Some of them permanently. Because I've caught them being dishonest, and they admit to being dishonest, and they claim that they have the right to do it. And then that they can do what they want in that regard. I have a fierce insistence on honesty. I think that it would be good for people in general to have a fierce insistence on honesty and to regard matters of integrity as being of very high importance again, because right now we don't regard integrity as being one of the highest attributes that a person can have and insisting on it. Many of the anecdotes contained in the pamphlets and in the verbal tradition demonstrate the prince's efforts to eliminate crime and dishonesty from his domain. However, despite the more positive interpretation, the Romanian verbal tradition also remembers Dracula as an exceptionally cruel and often capricious ruler. There are several events that are common to all the pamphlets, regardless of their nation of origin. Many of these events are also found in the Romanian verbal tradition. Specific details may vary among the different versions of these anecdotes, but the general course of events usually agrees to a remarkable extent. For example, in some versions, the foreign ambassadors received by Dracula at Târgovista are Florentine, in others they are Turkish. The nature of their offense against the prince also varies from version to version. However, all versions agree that Dracula, in response to some real or imagined insult, had their hats nailed to their heads. Okay. Some of the sources view Dracula's actions as justified, others view his acts as crimes of wanton and senseless cruelty. I'd say it depends on the length of the nail there. There are about 9 anecdotes that are almost universal in the Dracula literature. Oh, here's going to get real interesting. 1. The Golden Cup. Dracula was known throughout his land for his fierce insistence on honesty and order. Thieves seldom dared practice their trade within Dracula's domain. They knew that the stake awaited any who were caught. Dracula was so confident in the effectiveness of his law that he placed a golden cup on display in the central square of Târgovista. The cup was never stolen and remained entirely unmolested throughout Dracula's reign. 2. The Foreign Merchant. A merchant from a foreign land once visited Dracula's capital of Târgovista. Aware of the reputation of Dracula's land for honesty, he left a treasure-laden cart unguarded in the street overnight. Returning to his wagon in the morning, the merchant was shocked to find 160 golden ducats missing. When the merchant complained of his loss to the prince, Dracula assured him that his money would be returned and invited him to remain in the palace that night. Dracula then issued a proclamation to the city: "Find the thief and return the money, or the city will be destroyed." Whoa. During the night, he ordered that 160 ducats plus extra will be taken from his own treasury and placed in the merchant's cart. Now, I thought he was unfair to the poor merchants. Huh? On returning to his cart in the morning and counting his money, the merchant discovered the extra ducat. The merchant returned to Dracula and reported that his money had indeed been returned plus an extra ducat. Meanwhile, the thief had been captured and turned over to the prince's guards, along with the stolen money. Dracula ordered the thief impaled and informed the merchant that if he had not reported the extra ducat, he would have been impaled alongside the thief. Yeah, you ain't stealing 1 ducat from old Dracula and his kingdom. 3. The 2 monks. There are several versions of this anecdote. In some, the two monks were from a Catholic monastery in Wallachia, or wandering Catholic monks from a foreign land. In either case, the Catholic monks would be viewed as representatives of a foreign power by Dracula. In other versions of the story, the monks were from a Romanian Orthodox establishment, the native church of Wallachia. Dracula's motivation also varies considerably among the different versions of the story. All versions of the story agree that two monks visited Dracula in his palace at Turgovista. Curious to see the reaction of the churchmen, Dracula showed them rows of impaled corpses in the courtyard. When asked their opinions of his actions by the prince, one of the monks responded, "You were appointed by God to punish evildoers." So a monk from the church, I presume, tells Dracula, "You were appointed by God to put these people on stakes." Well, that doesn't sound too far from the Catholic ideology, to tell you the truth. The other monk had the moral courage to condemn the cruel... Oh, okay. So he's a fucking pussy, basically. To condemn the cruel prince. In the version of the story most common in the German pamphlets, Dracula rewarded the sycophantic monk and impaled the honest monk. He impaled the fucking pussy, is what they meant to say. In the version found in Russian pamphlets and in Romanian verbal tradition, Dracula rewarded the honest monk for his integrity and courage, and impaled the sycophant for his dishonesty. Four, the Polish nobleman. Benedict de Boythor, a Polish nobleman in the service of the King of Hungary, visited Dracula at Turgovista in September of 1458. At dinner one evening, Dracula ordered a golden sphere brought and set up directly in front of the royal envoy. Dracula then asked the envoy why he thought this spear had been set up. Benedict replied that he imagined that some boyar had offended the prince and that Dracula intended to honor him. Dracula then responded that he had, in fact, had the spear set up in the honor of his noble Polish guest. The Pole then responded that had he done anything to deserve death, that Dracula should do as he thought best. He further asserted that in that case, Dracula would not be responsible for his own death. Rather, he would be responsible for his own death for incurring the displeasure of the prince. Dracula was greatly pleased by this answer and showered the man with gifts, while declaring that had he answered in any other manner, he would have been impaled immediately. Oh, that's a smart Pole, ain't it? 5. The foreign ambassadors. There are at least two versions of this story in the literature. As with the story of the two monks, one version is common in the German pamphlets and views Dracula's actions unfavorably, while the other version is common in Eastern Europe and sees Dracula's actions in a much more favorable light. In both versions, ambassadors of a foreign power visit Dracula's court at Turgovista. When he granted an audience with the prince, the envoys refused to remove their hats as was the custom when in the presence of the prince in Wallachia. Angered at this sign of disrespect, Dracula had the ambassadors' hats nailed to their heads so they might never remove them. In the German version of the story, the envoys are Florentine and refuse to remove their hats to demonstrate their superiority. When Dracula asked the ambassadors why they wouldn't remove their hats, they responded that such was not their custom and that they wouldn't remove their hats, even for the Holy Roman Emperor. Dracula immediately had their hats nailed to their head so that they might never come off, and had the ambassadors ejected from his court. In Germany and in the West, where the concept of diplomatic immunity was given least lip service, this was held to be an act of barbarity against the representatives of a friendly power. In the version of the story common in the East, the envoys are Turkish. When ushered into the presence of the prince, the Turks refused to remove their Phrygian caps. What is a Muslim Ottoman Turk doing with a Phrygian cap. When questioned, they answered that it was not the custom of their fathers to remove their hats. Dracula then ordered their hats nailed to their heads with 3 nails so that they might never have to break such an excellent tradition. The envoys were sent back to the Sultan. In the East, this was held to be a courageous act in defiance in the face of the Ottoman Sultan. It should also be noted that the nailing of hats to heads of those who displeased a monarch was not an unknown act in Eastern Europe. Apparently this method was occasionally used by the princes of Moscow when faced by unpleasant envoys. 6. Dracula's mistress. Dracula once had a mistress who lived in the house in the back streets of Tergovista. This woman apparently loved the prince to distraction and was always anxious to please him. Dracula was often moody and depressed, and the woman made every effort to lighten her lover's burdens. Once, when Dracula was particularly depressed, the woman dared tell him a lie in order to cheer him up. She told him that she was with child. I guess that means pregnant. Dracula warned the woman not to joke about such matters, but she insisted on the truth of her claim despite her knowledge of the prince's feelings about dishonesty. Dracula had the woman examined by the bath matrons to determine the veracity of her claim. When informed that the woman was lying... Wait a minute. How does a bath matron determine whether a woman is pregnant? When informed the woman was lying, Dracula drew his knife and cut her open from her groin to her breast while proclaiming his desire for the world to see where he had been. Dracula then left the woman to die in agony. Okay. I don't believe that for a second. Seems like more cheap dime store horror fiction content that they throw in there to make it interesting. Like, no. 7. The Lazy Woman. Dracula once noticed a man working in the fields while wearing a too short caftan. The prince stopped and asked the man whether or not he had a wife. When the man answered in the affirmative, Dracula had the woman brought before him and asked her how she spent her days. The poor, frightened woman stated that she spent her days washing, baking, and sewing. The prince pointed out her husband's short caftan as evidence of her laziness and dishonesty and ordered her impaled despite her husband's protestations that he was well satisfied with his wife. Dracula then ordered another woman to marry the peasant, but admonished her to work hard or she would suffer her predecessor's fate. 8. The Nobleman with a Keen Sense of Smell. On St. Bartholomew's Day in 1459, Dracula caused 30,000... Oh, wait. Dracula caused 30,000 of the merchants and nobles of the Transylvanian city of Brasov to be impaled. What the hell does that mean, caused? In order that he might better enjoy the results of his orders, the prince commanded that his table be set up and that his boyars join him for a feast amongst the forest of impaled corpses. While dining, Dracula noticed that one of his boyars was holding his nose in an effort to alleviate the terrible smell of clotting blood and emptied bowels. Dracula then ordered the sensitive nobleman impaled on a stake higher than all the rest, so that he might be above the stench. In another version of this story, the sensitive nobleman is an envoy of the Transylvanian cities of Brasov and Sibiu, sent to appeal to the cruel Wallachian to spare those cities. While hearing the nobleman's appeal, Dracula walked amongst the stakes and their grisly burdens. Some of the victims still lived. Nearly overcome by the smell of drying blood and human wastes, the nobleman asked the prince why he walked amidst the awful stench. Dracula then asked the envoy if he found the stench oppressive. The envoy, seeing an opportunity to ingratiate himself with Dracula, responded that his only concern was for the health and welfare of the prince. Dracula, angered at the nobleman's dishonesty, ordered him impaled on the spot on a very high stake, so that he might be above the offending odors. 9. The burning of the sick and poor. Dracula was very concerned that all his subjects work and contribute to the common welfare. He once noticed that the poor, vagrants, beggars, and cripples had become very numerous in his land. Subsequently, he issued an invitation for all the poor and sick in Wallachia to come to Turgovista for a great feast, claiming that no one should go hungry in his land. As the poor and crippled arrived in the city, they were ushered into a great hall, where a fabulous feast was prepared for them. The prince's guests ate and drank late into the night, when Dracula himself made an appearance. "What else do you desire? Do you want to be without cares, lacking nothing in this world?" asked the prince. When they responded positively, Dracula ordered the hall boarded up and set on fire. None escaped the flames. Dracula explained his action to the boyars by claiming that he did this in order that they may represent no further burden to other men, so that no one will be poor in my realm. So basically, it looks like his honesty to the death is coming into effect here, and he asks them, "What else do you desire? Do you want to be without cares, lacking nothing in this world?" And they said, "Yes." And that's a lie to him, because they're beggars and stuff, so he burns the whole place down. Or so the story goes. Part 6. Dracula and the Vampire Myth. It is unclear why Bram Stoker chose this 15th century Romanian prince as the model for his fictional vampire. Stoker was friends with a Hungarian professor from Budapest, and many have suggested that Dracula's name might have been mentioned by this friend. Regardless of how the name came to Stoker's attention, the cruel history of the Impaler would have readily loaned itself to Stoker's purposes. The events of Dracula's life were played out in a region of the world that was still basically medieval, even in Stoker's time. The Balkans had only recently shaken off the Turkish yoke when Stoker started working on his novel, and the superstitions of the Dark Ages were still prevalent. Transylvania had long been a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it too had endured a long period of Turkish domination, and its culture was still largely medieval. The legend of the vampire was and still is deeply rooted in that region. There have always been vampire-like creatures in the mythologies of many cultures. However, the vampire, as he became known in Europe and hence America, largely originated in the Slavic and Greek lands of Eastern Europe. A veritable epidemic of vampirism swept through Eastern Europe beginning in the late 17th century and continuing through the 18th century. The number of reported cases rose dramatically in Hungary and the Balkans. From the Balkans, the plague spread westward into Germany, Italy, France, England, and Spain. Travelers returning from the Balkans brought with them tales of the undead, igniting an interest in the vampire that has continued to this day. You know, that doesn't sound right to me. Tales of the undead. What undead? You're saying they had tales of the undead. And you're saying, like, it's an actual tale of something that happened, like you saw undead. And apparently the plague surrounds all this rise of vampirism. Now, what's to say that these weren't people with a fixation on drinking blood and that they were the original cause of the plague spreading so far and wide? Is that possible? I don't know. Anyway, continuing on. Philosophers in the West began to study the phenomenon. I bet they did. It was during this period that Dom Augustin Calmet wrote his famous treatise on vampirism in Hungary. So this vampirism, it was a big thing. Like, it was a cult thing going on there. Far and wide across the land. Very strange. It was also during this period that authors and playwrights began to explore the vampire myth. Stoker's novel was merely culminating the work of a long series of works that were inspired by the reports coming from the Balkans and Hungary. Given the history of the vampire myth in Europe, it is perhaps natural that Stoker should place his great vampire in the heart of the region that gave birth to the myth. Once Stoker had determined on a locality, Vlad Dracula would stand out as one of the most notorious rulers of the selected region. He was obscure enough that few would recognize the name, and those who did would know him for his acts of brutal cruelty. Dracula was the natural candidate for vampirism. Why Stoker chose to relocate his vampire from Wallachia to the north in Transylvania remains a mystery. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I would bet that this Stoker guy, this Bram Stoker, was put up to this by somebody. Maybe he was involved in a secret society and this was a mission he was given in order to ascend among the ranks. I don't doubt that a lot of that stuff went on. The vampire myth is still widespread in Eastern Europe. Similarly, the name of Dracula is still remembered in the Romanian oral traditions, but that is the end of any connection between Dracula and the vampire myth in folklore. Outside of Stoker's novel, the name of Dracula was never linked with the myth of the vampire. No, that's where you're wrong, author. If I say Dracula, that's all people know about Dracula. They don't need to read the novel. They don't need to have seen the movie. If I say the name Dracula in today's modern society, that's what everybody associates with him. Which is why I said maybe Stoker was put up to this by some secret society that he was a member of. Despite his inhuman cruelty, in Romania, Dracula is remembered as a national hero who resisted the Turkish conquerors and asserted Romanian national sovereignty against the powerful Hungarian kingdom. And that's the end of the essay. April 30th, 1992. Ray Porter, a.k.a. The Dragon. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.